A. Independence and dependence of self-consciousness, lordship, and bondage. 178. Self-consciousness exists in and for itself, when and by the fact that it so exists for another. That is, it exists only in being acknowledged. The notion of this, its unity, in its duplication embraces many and varied meanings. Its moments then must be on the one hand be held strictly apart, and on the other hand must be in this differentiation at the same time also be taken and known as not distinct, or in their opposite significance. The twofold significance of the distinct moments has in the nature of self-consciousness to be infinite, or directly the opposite of the determinateness in which it is posited. The detailed exposition of the notion of the spiritual unity in its duplication will present us with the process of recognition. 179. Self-consciousness is faced by another self-consciousness. It has come out of itself. This has a twofold significance. First, it has lost itself, for it finds itself as another being. Secondly, in doing so, it has superseded the other, for it does not see the other as an essential being, but in the other sees its own self. 180. It must supersede this otherness of itself. This is the supersession of the first ambiguity, and is therefore itself a second ambiguity. First, it must proceed to supersede the other independent being, in order thereby to become certain of itself as the essential being. Secondly, in so doing, it proceeds to supersede its own self, for this other is itself. 181. This ambiguous supersession of its ambiguous otherness is equally an ambiguous return into itself. For first, through the supersession, it receives back its own self, because, by superseding its otherness, it again becomes equal to itself. But secondly, the other self-consciousness equally gives it back again to itself, for it saw itself in the other, but supersedes this being of itself in the other, and thus lets the other again go free. 182. Now, this movement of self-consciousness in relation to another self-consciousness has in this way been represented as the action of one self-consciousness, but this action of the one has itself the double significance of being both its own action and the action of the other as well. For the other is equally independent and self-contained, and there is nothing in it of which it is not itself the origin. The first does not have the object before it merely as it exists primarily for desire, but as something that has an independent existence of its own, which therefore it cannot utilize for its own purposes, if that object does not, of its own accord, do what the first does to it. Thus, the movement is simply the double movement of the two self-consciousnesses. Each sees the other do the same as it does. Each does itself what it demands of the other, and therefore also does what it does only insofar as the other does the same. Action by one side only would be useless, because what is to happen can only be brought about by both. 183. Thus, the action has a double significance, not only because it is directed against itself as well as against the other, but also because it is indivisibly the action of one as well as of the other. 184. In this movement, we see repeated the process which presented itself as the play of forces, but repeated now in consciousness. What in that process was for us is true here of the extremes themselves. The middle term is self-consciousness, which splits into the extremes, and each extreme is this exchanging of its own determinateness and an absolute transition into the opposite. Although it's consciousness, it does indeed come out of itself. Yet, though out of itself, it is at the same time kept back within itself, is for itself, and the self outside it is for it. It is aware that it at once is and is not another consciousness, and equally that this other is for itself, only when it supersedes itself as being for itself, and is for itself only in the being for self of the other. Each is for the other the middle term, through which each mediates itself with itself and unites with itself, and each is for itself and for the other an immediate being on its own account, which at the same time is such only through this mediation. They recognize themselves as mutually recognizing one another. 185. We now have to see how the process of this notion of recognition, of the duplicating of self-consciousness in its oneness, appears to self-consciousness. At first, it will exhibit the side of the inequality of the two, or the splitting up of the middle term into the extremes, which as extremes are opposed to one another, one being only recognized, the other only recognizing.